maybe give everybody like a 30,000-foot view of what a circle of competence is.
I believe it was popularized by Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. Basically, this idea that we all have our areas or zones of genius. And so if you can understand where your area of genius is in investing and the stock market, then you can increase your chances of success. And there's a bit of humility there to say, like, it's too hard to know everything about every stock in the stock market. So you kind of draw this perimeter where you're limiting yourself to say, okay, I'm going to try to be just as reasonable as I can to say I'm going to try to find an edge in a little bit of expertise. That's kind of how I think about circle of competence. Do you kind of see it similar? What are some of the benefits, or are there cons to that approach? How do you see it?
Well, I think it's a $20 word or $20 phrase, right? It when you hear circle of competence, you're like, wow, what does that mean? That just sounds very like a big idea. And I think the way you described it is a great way to think about it. The way I look at it is it's an area that you feel comfortable looking at companies and understanding what it is they do and trying to figure out who their competitors are and just how well you think the company will do. And I think there's pros and cons. Well, would there be cons? There's certainly pros to this, where there's the better you understand where you are in the fringes of your circle of competence. It's not necessarily like the core idea of like, hey, I can really understand retail companies, for example. I think that's pretty much a given. It's when you start to push the edges of the envelope, so to speak. So if you start to try to understand, defense companies or companies that work in the the industry of the military, like, do you really understand how those companies work? And if you don't, then I think I guess the con would be if you stray beyond your circle of competence, you could get yourself in a lot of trouble. If you start trying to buy things that are outside of your area of expertise, or even just things that you don't understand, you can lose a lot of money very, very quickly if you try to branch into things that you just don't understand. Like I think a perfect example for me of a con would be if I decided I wanted to invest in Exxon and I know nothing about commodities and how they work. And because Exxon deals with commodities, oil, and if I don't understand oil and how that whole system works and the pricing of oil and how that can really impact Exxon, I could set myself up for some pretty large losses if I don't understand that. And so I think that's where you really need to understand not necessarily your core competency of a circle of competence, but where your edges are. And if you don't do that, buyer beware.
Yeah. And even past just businesses or industries, I think there's a circle of competence in the type of strategy you choose. Is your temperament or the things you find in the ways you behave, does it match up with the types of stocks you're trying to buy and the way you're trying to go about it? If you're a numbers genius who can write algorithms to take advantage of fractional differences in the market, and that kind of stuff excites you, like a Renaissance Technologies, right? Mm-hmm. Then maybe like a super high frequency trading algorithm thing is more suited to that kind of skill set versus some of the stuff that I like to talk about and Dave likes to talk about is very long-term and a lot more passive. And so the skill sets, the things you're looking at, the ways you're analyzing things are all going to be different depending on what area of investor style you're trying to really use.
Right. So I guess the question when I think about circle of competence is, number one, how do you determine what your circle of competence is? Like, how do you think about that? How did you maybe think back to the early days 10 years ago? Like, how did you determine what your circle of competence was or is? And I guess that would be interesting to discuss.
Yeah. A bit unfair because my approach was a lot different back then. It was very numbers based, and I was kind of trying to model some of the things I saw from books like What Works on Wall Street or The Acquirer's Multiple. This idea of just buying the stock that's cheap, regardless of why it's cheap, and that can win. Probabilistically that can win, but you also have to get your buys and sells correct, and that's the hard part. So I didn't. I maybe you could argue that my circle of competence then was more so like I was sticking to a certain universe of price to earnings, price to book kind of thing, and so I did not. If there was a good thing I did at that time is I did not break those rules. I didn't all of a sudden buy a PE of 50 because everybody else around me was buying it and I wanted to be like them.
Right.
So I had a system and I stuck to it. That was a good thing I did. The bad part was it didn't fit with my overall goals for my personal life. And so that's why I had to change.
Mm-hmm.
What about you? Take us back to when you first started investing, and what was your first circle of competence and how did you identify it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think because I was working in a bank, I think I gravitated towards financials, and I think I had some misguided idea that I really understood them because I worked in a bank. I kind of took that Peter Lynch idea of buy what you know, and I kind of extrapolated that to a circle of competence. And because I worked at a bank, I felt like I understood them. And so then that became the thing that I looked at the most. Obviously, reading through Wells Fargo's 10K, reading through JP Morgan's, epistle, and trying to learn everything I could possibly learn about banks. And it did appeal to me because they were number based, and there was lots of numbers you had to learn, lots of ratios you had to learn, and that appealed to me. And so I really felt like those were an area, that and real estate and insurance were two places that I felt like, and mostly that was because of reading a lot of Warren Buffett, and because he talks about those endlessly in his shareholder letters. And if you want to learn how insurance companies work, read through his letters, because he goes into a lot of detail to really help you understand how they make money and what to look for and what not to look for. And it could be very, very helpful. And so that to me was really kind of how I started. And like you, I kind of tried to follow the number game too a little bit. And I probably wasn't as diligent about it as I should have been, but that was really kind of how I first started, for sure. So I guess looking back on that now, how do you feel like you've morphed into what you feel like your circle of competence may be now?
Yeah, I'm still trying to push the boundaries as much as I can within reason. So, I mean, it's no secret I have the newsletter that I do. So every month there's a deadline. So I figure if I'm spending time to expand my circle of competence, I'm not saying this is the right way to do it. It's just how I do it. If I know I'm going to tackle a new industry or something that maybe is tangential, but I haven't really done super deep dives on the companies in there, I'll try to make sure I have enough time before the end of the month before doing something like that. Like when I dove into steel randomly, which ended up helping like 2 months later. But to me, like having that, and then if there's not enough time, knowing that I do have a circle of competence in other areas that I can not steal from is not the right word, but I can play in those fields. And that works out for me. And it kind of takes a little bit of the pressure off too, to know that, all right, realistically, am I going to find a bargain deal every month? Probably not. So do I have these circles of competence that I can look and say, okay, out of all these things I already know that I'm already confident in, which one is the best relative opportunity out of those, and be able to pick to that. That's because I do dollar cost averaging, which is something we have talked about endlessly on the show. But maybe somebody applying that who doesn't dollar cost average just kind of sits on their hands until they have, the bargain of the year or something. So I hope that's helpful in the sense that like that's kind of how I apply it, but it's very personal in the way I'm trying to invest, the constraints I put on myself, like dollar cost averaging, and just trying to be realistic with working with what I have. And I would definitely say that this isn't something that I just figured out overnight. This has been just a process kind of going on behind the scenes that has naturally taken root just after lots of practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of practice.
Yeah. What about you?
Oh, that's a good question. I think for me it's been for me it's been a journey of curiosity. So the big thing for me is trying to follow what I find interesting. And I think alongside that, I can operate under a bit of a different, I guess, method than you can because I don't have that pressure of having to come up with, something to do every month. And so I kind of operate from a different mindset in that I can follow my curiosity. So I can go down a payments rabbit hole. I can go down a battery rabbit hole. I can go down a solar energy rabbit hole and learn all these things about these different areas. I can try to learn as much as I can about semiconductors, things like that that I can poke around on that may or may not have necessarily been part of my circle of competence originally, but because I can follow my curiosity and I can spend time trying to learn about those areas without the pressure of having to invest in something, I think gives me the ability to, I guess, broaden my circle of competence